Okay guys, so this is a video that I have been so excited to make and it has taken so much time, but we're finally putting our hand into the fire here. We are talking about the differences between laptop GPUs and their desktop alternatives. And I know what everybody's gonna say. Laptop GPUs just don't stack up in any way to what's available on the desktop. But through a ton of testing, we actually found that that might not be true all the time. So what I wanted to get into here is we have a ton of laptops. We have every single NVIDIA GPU of the RTX 5000 series. We wanted to do a real, honest to God, apples to apples comparison. And this is how we did it. Basically, we took 6 laptops running in their highest performance mode, all with Ryzen 9 9955HX or 9955HX 3D processors, and paired them up with RTX 5000 series laptop GPUs all the way down to the newest entry-level RTX 5050. The GPUs and CPUs were all running as close as possible to their maximum rated wattages, and to keep things as similar as possible, we're only using 2 laptop models, the MSI Raider and ROG Strix G16. Anyways, those laptops were aligned with either the desktop 9950X or 9955HX 3D, along with their matching GPUs, none of which were pre-overclocked out of the box. Also, in order to further level the playing field here, these laptops output their display signals to an external monitor rather than their internal displays. Now, you might be wondering why we're using the Ryzen 9000 series CPUs instead of Intel's 200HX series, and there's a few reasons for that. First of all, the 9955HX and HX3D have benchmark metrics that are within spitting distance of their desktop counterparts, even in lightly threaded workloads. Also, the 9955HX series tends to outperform Intel's 200 series CPUs in gaming, and that reduces the chances of CPU bottlenecking here. So it was a natural fit. So I think we can all agree, one of the most hotly debated topics in the whole laptop versus desktop GPU conversation is how these things are named by NVIDIA, right? Because every single laptop GPU has a corresponding desktop GPU that has basically the exact same name. So on paper, when you're first looking at these things, it might look like, hey, look, a 5090 on desktop is the same as the laptop, but that is not true whatsoever, at least not with the high-end GPUs. So a laptop RTX 5090 actually gets less cores than a desktop 5080, and the memory side of the equation gets a major cut too. The same can be said of the 5080, which gets about 1,300 less cores than the desktop RTX 5070 Ti, while offering a similar memory layout. The RTX 5070 Ti laptop GPU, meanwhile, gets the exact same treatment as the 5090, with a ton less cores and a slashed memory interface too. As a matter of fact, the laptop 5070 Ti's direct analog on the desktop side is actually the RTX 5070. The cuts do continue as we go lower in the product stack, with the RTX 5070 just getting massacred in every way possible. I'd say it's close to a desktop RTX 5060 Ti, but it actually gets less memory than the 16GB version of that specific card. Frequencies and core counts take it on the chin too. Not only that, but it runs at a maximum of just 100 watts, putting it in line with the much lower end RTX 5060 and 5050. And that RTX 5060, well, this is where the specification gap between laptop and desktop GPUs starts narrowing quite a bit. There's a cut of just 500 CUDA cores versus the desktop part, and it operates at a very similar frequency if given enough power. But to me, the RTX 5050 laptop GPU is probably the most interesting one here. Not only does it have the exact same number of cores, but it also uses GDDR7 instead of GDDR6, which leads to vastly improved bandwidth numbers. And if a laptop manufacturer feeds it with just enough juice, it can actually run at higher frequencies than a desktop RTX 5050 graphics card. And speaking of power, I think this will be a section that we have to get into in a ton of detail, because power is a critical differentiating factor between laptop GPUs and their desktop counterparts. Basically, what you see is what you get on the desktop, but with laptops, it can vary just so much. And this is something that will either make or break laptop GPUs. For a higher level view, let's plot the official maximum TGP of desktop cards and then overlay the laptop GPUs. Since laptops have much less thermal capacity, GPUs in this space are specifically tuned to run in much lower power envelopes. In addition to that, every one of them also has a pretty wide power range. If we drill down just a bit further, they can need as little as 35 watts all the way up to an RTX 5090's 150 watts. This is basically done to accommodate the huge number of different laptop designs and their highly variable cooling capabilities. So if we bring an RTX 5090 laptop example into this with the MSI Raider we're using for all of the benchmarks in this video, it also varies its power input on a game dependent basis. But it's a thick boy that weighs over 7 pounds, giving it the space for a pretty massive cooling assembly. So let's add the much thinner and lighter Blade 16 to this, and its 5090 naturally has access to substantially less power, and that will lead to lower core frequencies and yes, less performance, actually up to 30% in some of our testing. The other wrinkle in this fabric for laptops is dynamic boost. It's supposed to dynamically shift power from the CPU to the GPU for additional performance if the algorithm detects there's enough thermal headroom. So if I bring us back to these laptop power ranges and add dynamic boost, it gives the 5070 Ti and above up to 25 watts more headroom, while the 5070 and below get up to 15 watts of overhead. And look, I know this might sound like a lot, but I can see why a lot of this can lead to a hell of a lot of consumer confusion and even leading buyers down a path that might see them making the wrong purchasing decision. I mean, we've seen like RTX 5090 laptops. The Blade 16 is a great example that come in a thin and light chassis. They say 5090, but because they're not feeding their GPU with enough power, well, guess what? They actually get just run right over by RTX 5080s running in a little bit higher wattage envelope in a slightly thicker design. And that's a huge problem, right? Because I can't emphasize this enough. Power is the absolute god king when it comes to laptop performance. And if we look at the power consumption landscape in Cyberpunk with the systems we're using, even the highest end laptop GPUs pushed to near their maximum TGP only use a fraction of what the desktop cards require. Even that flagship 5090, it needs only as much juice as a desktop RTX 5060 Ti, but as we go downwards, the gap does narrow quite a bit. That's mostly because today's gaming laptops typically don't have any trouble handling GPUs in the 100 to 125 watt range. So the lower end GPUs can flex almost up to that point without much trouble at all. And what all of that tuning leads to that I talked about before is absolutely insane performance per watt numbers for a lot of these laptop GPUs. I mean, look, Nvidia needed to squeeze every iota of horsepower out of these cores within a strictly limited power and thermal envelope, and that's exactly what they've done. But regardless of how we look at things from a power standpoint, I know that the assumption is there that laptop GPUs will never hold a candle to what desktop cards can accomplish. You know the mantra that you've heard, right? Twice the price, half the performance. But you know what? That's not really true, because we went deep enough to find that some of these laptop GPUs can actually outperform their desktop counterparts. And that is an interesting factor in this story. Let's start with Alan Wake, and I'll be straightforward here, this is not going to be pretty. In this game, the ultra expensive RTX 5090 laptop GPU actually loses to the RTX 5070 Ti desktop card, while the RTX 5080 laptop is barely any faster than a 5070. Also, while there's a massive performance gap between the fastest desktop options here, the top two laptop GPUs are separated by less than 10 frames per second, and even less than that in their 1% lows. Things don't get all that much better with the laptop RTX 5070 series, where they straddle the desktop RTX 5060 Ti 16GB, but under that, things start to get really interesting. There's only about 10% separating the RTX 5060s and the laptop RTX 5050 is actually able to tie the desktop variant's performance. Things are a bit different in Black Myth Wukong, with the entire range tightening up quite a bit. So while there's still a massive gap between the two 5090s, it's a lot narrower than before. The laptop version now beats the 5070 Ti desktop card, while the RTX 5070 Ti is starting to pull pretty far ahead of the desktop 5060 Ti it tied in the last game. But after that, there's a huge performance drop-off, with the laptop 5070's 8GB of memory sinking its results just into the toilet. And yet the relative strength of the laptop cards in this test in particular really does shine through with the 5060 and 5050, both of which were able to stay ahead of their desktop alternatives. That situation on the low end happens again in Horizon Forbidden West, with the lower end discrete cards taking a bit of a beating from the laptop side. Meanwhile, the higher end laptop GPUs tend to struggle to compete against desktop products that are technically much lower in Nvidia's lineup. I mean, look at the RTX 5070 again. It just feels like an afterthought. Its 8GB of memory just becomes a huge limiting factor for a GPU in its price range. Warhammer is another game that just slaps around the higher end laptop GPUs like no one's business, to the point where the RTX 5090 can barely tie an RTX 5070, and that laptop 5070, well, it's pathetic again, barely able to eke out a win against the desktop 5060. But there's a silver lining again with those lower end laptop GPUs, which are able to stay ultra competitive and either match or pull slightly ahead of the desktop versions. For the most part, a lot of those standings repeat themselves from one game to another, with the laptop 5090 taking a backseat to a 5070 Ti even in a game like this, where the desktop RTX 5090's average is only about 33% higher. That's followed by the 5080 and 5070 Ti falling behind the 5070 and so on. But unlike some of the other titles we've seen, the two RTX 5060s are separated by a lot of open ground here, while the 5050s end up being in a dead heat once again. CS2 doesn't change that overall narrative either, but let's stop for a second here and appreciate how far laptop GPU performance has come. I mean, sure, the 5090 is still pretty far behind its desktop sibling, but we have to remember it's also using a fraction of the power to get numbers that come close to an RTX 5080. And yes, you absolutely have to manage your expectations accordingly with any entry-level discrete card, but the RTX 5050 is consistently beating its desktop counterpart. It happens in Cyberpunk 2 with the 5060 joining in on the party by essentially matching the output from its more power-hungry sibling. Still though, it's sad to see the RTX 5070 struggling so much. Nvidia had an opportunity to make this thing so much better, like the perfect mid-tier laptop GPU, but instead it barely manages to stay ahead of the two RTX 5060s here. And as we move upwards in the stack, it becomes pretty evident that in games with higher detail levels like this one, higher end laptop GPUs are completely overmatched by what's being offered on the desktop side, to the point where there's now a gap of 74% separating the two 5090s. And it gets worse for all the laptop GPUs in Doom, with cards like the 5070 losing to the desktop RTX 5060 of all cards, and just getting pounded by the RTX 5060 Ti. The only mobile part to narrowly beat the RTX 5070 is the epically expensive RTX 5090. But again, we have the 5050 becoming the only GPU here that doesn't get completely owned, though that's because the regular 5050 is just so terrible. And given how demanding Space Marine is, I expected most of the laptop GPUs to get slammed like they did in Doom, but some of them actually put up a pretty good fight. Like the RTX 5050 stays ahead of the desktop card, while the RTX 5060s are effectively tied again. I mean, sure, the gap between those higher end cards can be as much as 37% with the 5090, but things aren't as bad as some people might have expected. And I know it might sound like I'm making excuses here, because for every Space Marine or CS2, there's a Hogwarts type situation where almost every laptop GPU gets creamed by their desktop counterparts. It gets so bad that the RTX 5090 even loses to a desktop RTX 5070 by a pretty significant margin, despite its 1% lows being slightly better. And if you based performance assumption on paper specifications alone, you'd think that at the very least a laptop RTX 5090 would come close to the RTX 5080, but it doesn't. It's not even close in most situations. And the main reason for this is the same thing that plagues the 5080, 5070 Ti, and 5072. It's clock speeds. Not only do their nerfed GDDR7 speeds contribute to a pretty significant memory bandwidth reduction, but their cores nominally run between 200 and sometimes even 400 megahertz lower than their desktop alternatives. That's also why the lower end of the laptop lineup performs comparatively a whole lot better. The frequency gap is so much narrower for the 5060, and the mobile RTX 5050 actually has a small clock speed advantage. But that also causes a bit of a nightmare situation for Nvidia, because their lowest end GPU, which is used in laptops that typically cost hundreds of bucks less than a comparable 5070 laptop, can sometimes come within 10% of that higher end card. So yeah, the real battles are being waged in the lower price brackets, but most people will likely focus on the positioning of Nvidia's higher end laptop GPUs against their desktop counterparts. And while a pretty efficient RTX 5090 laptop never really had any chance of matching the desktop card, they're sometimes a lot closer to one another than you might have expected, especially when both are paired up with comparable processors. And as we round out gameplay testing, I don't think Starfield really shows anything we didn't already know. Yes, these laptop graphics processors have come a long way, but they're still handicapped by the chassis they're used in, whereas the desktop side has so much more room to flex. And before we go on, there's a topic here that I absolutely need to talk about a little bit more, and that's the story that we're seeing with the RTX 5060 and 5050. Those two laptop GPUs basically buck every single assumption that's out there that says laptop GPU does not equal desktop GPU. Those things, they either matched or in some cases beat their desktop counterparts. And a lot of you are probably wondering, what in the world is going on here? And we wanted to dive a little bit further into that. And let's tackle that 5060 first. The mobile 5060 does run faster in the vast majority of games, but the biggest gaps in those clock speeds directly correlate to games where it won. So basically, what's happening here is that the higher clock speeds are offsetting the fact that it has a lower number of CUDA cores. On the 5050 side, this situation becomes even more apparent, mostly because the desktop card is so utterly gimped. Not only does it have access to significantly less memory bandwidth, but wherever the laptop card comes out ahead by the most, its core speed also takes a hit. Anyways, the next step of this video is to push things even further and segment out the highest end laptop and desktop GPUs and run them at 4K. And I'm gonna blitz through this pretty quickly because the positioning of these GPUs doesn't really change all that much from one game to another. We're now seeing the desktop 5090 pulling way further ahead, often doubling the laptop GPU's performance, while the 1% lows get to even more extreme levels. In addition to that, while there is a massive, like Grand Canyon size gap between the RTX 5080 and 5090 desktop parts, those same GPUs are often less than 20% apart on the laptop side at 4K. To me, that causes a bit of like an identity crisis for Nvidia flagship GPUs, since neither is really well positioned for 4K gaming without significantly lowering detail levels. So if you're buying a laptop for gaming exclusively, I'd recommend skipping that pricey UHD screen upgrade if you can avoid it. You'll never want to game at that resolution due to the performance drop off from these laptop GPUs. I also need to call your attention here to the RTX 5080 and 5070 Ti, because in most games, they're just complete non-starters at this resolution, sometimes due to their smaller memory footprints, and other times it's because their cores are so heavily cut down versus their desktop counterparts. I mean, sure, something like multi-frame generation and DLSS would help these things get a little bit further ahead, but seriously, I'm gonna say this again, just avoid 4K gaming on laptops. So that rounds up our gaming testing, but I hope by this point you know this is not where we stop. None of these discrete GPUs or these systems are one-dimensional devices these days. They're expected to pull double duty as a creator tool or something that's going to be processing AI workloads as well. And that's where we wanted to sort of find out if the laptops would drop even further behind the desktop cards. And again, there's going to be some surprises here, guys. In Blender, while the desktop RTX 5090's raw horsepower allows it to push way ahead of everything else here, the two 5080s are pretty evenly matched. But again, it's the RTX 5060 and 5050 that are the most entertaining here by managing to beat the desktop cards by relatively huge margins. And Resolve, well, it also took a little bit of a weird turn, but this one is more easily explained. Basically, 16 gigabytes of VRAM or more is absolutely critical to get the fastest possible time, whereas 8 gigabytes or less becomes a major bottleneck. That's why all the 8 gig laptop GPUs get around the same time in this test, with the 5060 and 5070 running in a statistical dead heat. On the higher end of the product stack though, the 5080 and 5090 do pretty well against their desktop siblings, though the 5070 Ti's 12 gigs coupled with its lower CUDA core count causes it to tie the RTX 5060 Ti. Premiere sees this situation flipped a bit, with the top 7 desktop and laptop GPUs all getting times that are within 40 or so seconds of one another. Even the RTX 5070 and mobile 5070 Ti finished the output in less than 5 minutes. But above that, well, there's certainly some challenges here for the laptop GPUs, with the 5070 getting soundly beaten by a desktop 5060. And speaking of the 5060, for whatever reason, our laptop with it got absolutely toasted here after failing to hit its nominal core frequency over and over again. So to me at least, this is more about the ROG team missing some platform-specific optimizations, since none, and I mean none, of our other 5060 laptops behave like this. Moving on to AI processing with an 8B instruction set, and the results pretty much align with our gaming tests, though this time the 5080 and 5070 Ti are essentially tied, pushing them well behind the vanilla RTX 5070 desktop. Meanwhile, that RTX 5090 laptop that costs almost $5,000 is more than 10% behind a desktop 5070 Ti, and the other mobile GPUs are all clustered there at the bottom. The only silver lining is they all beat the atrociously bad 5050 desktop card. Add in a 14B test to this and every single 8GB card just falls right off the table, since you really do need 12 gigs or more of memory to run this properly. And that's bad news, since literally half of Nvidia's laptop lineup has less memory than that. Okay, I know up to this point there's been just so much data to consume, but I hope that all of this allows you, and I know it allowed us, to have a better understanding of where laptop and desktop GPUs compare to one another. But I also wanted to do sort of like a Cliff's Notes version, where we took all of the gameplay testing and distilled it down into some overall benchmarks. And look, no one, and I mean nobody, is going to argue from a raw performance standpoint, laptop GPUs are inferior in every conventional sense of the word. But given their constraints in terms of form factor, power, cooling, and so many other things, I happen to think they're pretty impressive overall. The RTX 5090 desktop GPU is about 54% faster than the laptop side. The 5080, 40%. The 5070 Ti sits at about 48%, which is actually a lot less than I would have thought it would be. Unfortunately, the 5070 has the biggest gap here at about 56%. But like I said before, this is honestly the worst card, in my opinion, in the entire RTX 5000 series laptop lineup. What happens below that though? Well, I'm not sure if I should, be celebrating for budget-focused laptop buyers or just laughing out loud at how bad the desktop cards are here. Either way, the RTX 5060s end up running neck and neck. And once the dust settled, the laptop RTX 5050 was marginally faster than the desktop version. And yet, if you move to 4K, laptop GPUs become a whole lot less competitive, with all of the desktop cards being at least 50% faster. But once again, the RTX 5080 is arguably the strongest performer here relative to its desktop alternative. Another thing you'll notice is the jump from one desktop GPU to the next is sometimes huge, whereas the laptop lineup is a lot tighter, especially the 5080 and 5090. And that's good news for people who want to pay less and get closer to high-level frame rates, but it also sinks the performance per dollar quotient on the flagship 5090 laptops. Like on the laptop side, an RTX 5090 gets just 16% more performance than a 5080, but that GPU will add a premium of almost $1,000 to a laptop build, and in some cases even more. Then again, yes, you can say that the desktop 5090 is also $1,000 more than a 5080, but for that additional money, you get notably better performance, something you absolutely don't have on a laptop. And speaking of pricing, no guys, this is not an area that I'm going to be dragged into. Look, I know that there's plenty of other areas on this video. I'm sure that you can burn me in the comments, but it's not going to be pricing. And the reason for that is pretty simple. Right now, this is such like a crazy fast moving target, right? RTX 5000 series laptops are seeing some heavy discounts right now, mostly because of the fact that they're just not selling as well as they should be. So what I say today is probably going to be completely invalid in a week or 2 weeks when this video comes out. There is one thing I did want to cover though, one which benefits desktops in a massive way, more than pricing or even overall performance, and that's noise. Because in order to get the performance levels we did from these laptops, they were run in their absolute highest power mode. And that leads to, well, some of them actually sounding like a jet engine, while the desktop system is relatively quiet. Of course, this will vary wildly from one device to another, though in general, laptops are louder than desktops. But what happens to performance if they weren't? Well, to find out, we took every single one of these laptops and tuned their power and fan speed profiles so they all hit about 40 decibels, which is approximately the same decibel reading that we got from the desktop system taken from about 30 inches away. So here's what our Cyberpunk results looked like with the highest laptop performance modes. And here is what happens at a normalized 40 decibels. We go from a pretty big hit on the 5070 Ti to absolutely devastating impacts on the 5080 and 5090. I mean, we're talking about 5060 Ti levels of performance for flagship laptops. The ironic thing here is the 5070, 5060, and 5050 weren't affected all that much since they were already running near 40 decibels to begin with, since the laptops could easily handle their lower heat output. But I have to stress this again though, these results are highly device dependent. The MSI Raider being used on the higher end laptop GPUs has a traditional and aging heat pipe based cooling system, and I'm sure models with a modern vapor chamber setup would fare a whole lot better. And the last thing I wanted to bring up is something we see in the comments all the time, and it's this major pain point when it comes to the comparison between the laptop GPUs and their desktop counterparts, and that's just the way that NVIDIA names these bloody things, right? What we've seen here is that an RTX 5090 laptop is not going to perform anywhere close to the desktop card, but they're named the exact same thing. And for many people, including me, that's a huge problem. And personally, NVIDIA, if you're watching this video, and I know you probably are, I'd like you to take a little bit of a different approach here for the sake of clarity. I absolutely have no problem with the RTX 5090 being the very top of your laptop lineup and the 5050 being the bottom. There's nothing wrong with those names. They designate a performance tier within a platform category. But what I want is I want you to get rid of this ridiculous laptop GPU thing that's at the end of every single one of these GPUs, because nobody really reads that anyways, because they know it's a GPU, they know it's in a laptop. What I want to see you bring back is the M for mobile, RTX 5090M. It's a different product. Make that differentiation part of the actual name. Anyways, I hope this whole insane in-depth video has given everyone at least some clarity, debunked some of the crazier claims about how fast or not modern laptops actually are, and maybe even provided a few surprises with those RTX 5060 and 5050 results. But most of all, from the bottom of my heart, right, I hope that this allows people to make more informed purchasing decision, and maybe more importantly, cut through some of the absolute sensationalism that's out there when it comes to comparing these two platforms. But anyways, I'm Mike with Hardware Canucks. I will see you in the next one. Have a great day, guys.